The floor under me cracked open and I dropped through smoke into a room that smelled like burnt wiring. 3 guards waited below. They did not expect company from the ceiling. I took the first one down before he turned around. The second one fired wild, the shot punching a hole through a crate of supplies instead of through me. I closed the gap, caught his wrist, and put him on the ground. The third one ran for an alarm panel on the far wall. I let him reach it. He pressed it anyway because that is what frightened people do, even when it will not save them. The alarm never sounded. I had cut the relay an hour earlier while the building was still asleep. I stepped over the man on the floor and checked his pulse out of habit rather than concern. Steady. He would wake with a headache and a story he would never tell his employer since the story ended with him failing to stop a single intruder from walking through his entire defense line in under 2 minutes. Pride made people quiet in strange ways. I had learned to count on that as much as I counted on locks and alarms and guards. This was the easy part of the job. The man I had come for, a smuggler named Corin Vask, was 3 floors up, locked in a private office, certain that his guards and his alarms and his thick metal door made him untouchable. People like him always believed that it was the last thing they believed before I proved them wrong. I climbed. The stairwell was narrow and dark, built for a species smaller than most of the ones who used it now. My boots barely fit on each step. I did not slow down for that. Slowing down was how operatives ended up dead, and I intended to keep collecting my pay for a very long time. The air grew warmer with every floor, thick with the smell of fuel and old metal, the particular scent of a building that had been retrofitted too many times by people who cared more about hiding things than fixing them. Somewhere above me, a door opened and closed. Footsteps crossing a room unhurried. Vask had no idea yet that anything was wrong. That was the part of the job I liked best, the quiet minutes before someone realized their whole world had already changed. Vask's door was the kind that cost more than the rest of the building, combined, reinforced, and coated, and triple locked. I did not bother with the lock. I went through the wall beside it instead, where the structure was old and tired and gave way after one hard strike. He was already moving for a side exit when I stepped through the dust. Short, soft-skinned man, 3 eyes wide, with a particular kind of fear that comes from finally meeting the thing you paid other people to never have to meet. Whatever they are paying you, he said, I will double it. They already paid me. I told him, you are just the part where I collect. He did not fight. Most of them do not. In the end, I had him restrained and moving down the stairwell within a minute, and by the time we reached the loading dock, my ship was already waiting with its ramp down, engines humming low and patient. I dropped him into the hold, sealed the door, and finally let my shoulders relax. People pay the conquered exchange a great deal of money to make problems disappear, and the exchange had built 300 years of reputation on doing exactly that, quietly and completely, no matter who the problem belonged to. Kings hired us to remove rivals. Rivals hired us to remove kings. We did not take sides, and we did not ask why. There was only one name on the whole list of beings across known space that the exchange would never under any circumstance agree to harm, and every operative learned that rule before they learned how to fly a ship or fire a weapon. it was not written down as a suggestion. It was written down as the only law that could end a career or a life faster than anything else in this business. That was when my comm chimed with an incoming contract. I almost ignored it. Standard procedure was to finish logging one job before opening the next, but the priority tag on this one was high enough that ignoring it would have cost me a penalty fee, and penalty fees were the only thing in this galaxy I genuinely resented. I opened the file from the cockpit while my ship lifted off the surface. The contract terms were generous, triple the standard rate for a retrieval, payment up front, no questions about method. That alone was not unusual. Clients with money like to pay for silence as much as they paid for results. What was unusual was the species field. Every contract that passed through the Concord exchange listed the target species before anything else. It was the first thing any operative checked because the exchange had exactly one rule that mattered more than payment, more than reputation, more than anything else. Written into guild law, this field was blank. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over the way I turned over anything that did not fit a pattern I recognized. Blank fields happen sometimes, usually with political work, where a client did not want a paper trail connecting them to a particular government or particular bloodline. It was rare, but it was not impossible. I told myself that, and I believed it enough to keep reading. The target's name was the only thing listed clearly. Daniel Cole, last known location, a transit station on the edge of neutral space, a place where 100 different species cross paths every day, and nobody asked anybody else too many questions. The job was retrieval, not termination, which made it easier to accept without much thought. Bring a person somewhere, hand them over, collect payment. I had done 1,000 jobs shaped exactly like that one. I accepted it before my ship cleared the planet's outer atmosphere. Vask shouted something from the hold about how he had friends in high places. I ignored him the way I ignored most things people said while restrained and frightened. By the time I delivered him to the drop point and watched the transfer of credit land in my account, the sun on that world had already begun to set, and I had a new destination locked into my navigation system. It was a 2-day flight to the transit station. I spent the first day sleeping because sleep was a resource I had learned to take wherever I could find it, and the second day reviewing the little information the contract had given me about Daniel Cole. He was not a fighter, not a smuggler, not a soldier. Nothing in his record suggested he had ever held a weapon for any reason beyond hunting or sport. He worked in data recovery, the kind of job that meant digging through wreckage and broken systems to pull out whatever information survived. Unremarkable by every measure. The file offered no criminal record, no outstanding debts large enough to explain a triple rate bounty, no family connections to anyone powerful enough to make an enemy worth this kind of money. I searched through every line the contract allowed me to see, looking for the one detail that would make sense of the price tag attached to his name, and I found nothing. Either the client had paid for silence on every detail that mattered, or Daniel Cole was simply an ordinary man who had stumbled into something he was never meant to find. Unremarkable people did not usually carry triple rate price tags. I told myself it did not matter. The job was Retrieval, I would find him, bring him in, and let the client worry about the rest. That was the arrangement I had built my entire career around, and questioning it past the point of necessity had never once made the work easier. Still, something about the blank species field kept circling back through my thoughts like a sound I could not quite place. I ran a standard biocan against the partial data. The contract had included a habit more than a necessity, the kind of thing I did automatically before any retrieval to know what I was walking into. The scan returned a heart rate, 1 heart, steady, ordinary, single heartbeat, sitting on my screen in soft green light, completely unremarkable to anyone who had not spent 300 years learning exactly which species carried two. I have 2 hearts. Most of the species I had ever hunted, retrieved, questioned, or escorted across the galaxy carried 2 or 3, or some arrangement built for redundancy in a universe that did not forgive weakness. 1 heart beating alone at that particular resting rhythm belonged to exactly one kind of creature. In the whole of known space, I sat very still in my chair and looked at that single number for a long time. I told myself there had to be another explanation, a scanning error, a corrupted file, a species I simply had not encountered yet in 3 centuries of travel. Despite how unlikely that sounded, even as I thought it, I ran the scan a second time, slower, checking every variable I could think to check, the way I had been trained to check a lock 3 times before deciding it could not be opened. The number did not change, the rhythm did not change. Everything about that small green line on my screen told me the same quiet, impossible thing. The ship hummed around me, steady and indifferent, carrying me closer to the station with every passing second, and I did not move to chain course. I did not move at all. I only sat there watching the number on the screen, while somewhere behind my ribs both of my hearts kept beating fast, and even like they already understood something I had not yet allowed myself to say out loud. A second message arrived on my comm before I had decided what to do with the first. It was from the Concord Exchange dispatch line, flagged for my attention only, sent less than a minute after I had accepted the contract. A backup operative had been assigned to the same job in case I failed to deliver on schedule. I read the name twice before it settled. Selvin Drosk. I had heard that name before, in the kind of conversation people only had in quiet rooms about operatives who finished jobs that other operatives quietly refused. Drosk did not hesitate. Drosk did not ask questions about blank fields or strange contracts or numbers on a screen that did not match what they were supposed to match. Droz collected payment and moved on and slept soundly, and that reputation was exactly why the exchange would have chosen that name to follow mine. The backup assignment had a timer attached to it, 72 hours starting from the moment I accepted the contract, and not 1 second longer. I looked at the clock in the corner of my screen. 68 hours and counting. Whatever I decided to do about the man with 1 heart, I would have to decide it fast. 68 hours was not much time to undo 3 centuries of habit. Every instinct I had built across a long career told me to fly to that transit station, find Daniel Cole, and finish the job before someone else could finish it for me. That instinct had kept me alive through wars, betrayals, and 100 contracts that should have got me killed. It had never once been wrong before. It was wrong now, and I knew it the moment I looked at that single heartbeat on my screen. I changed course before I had a plan, which was not how I usually worked. Instead of the transit station, I set a heading for a small archive world on the edge of Guild territory, a quiet, forgettable place where the Concord Exchange kept records that most operatives never bothered to read. Every contract, every payment, every rule the exchange had ever written down lived somewhere in that archive, buried under 300 years of dust and bureaucracy. I needed to know exactly what I was risking before I decided how far I was willing to risk it. The archive world had one settlement, a low cluster of buildings wrapped around a records hall that looked far too modest for the amount of history it contained. I landed my ship on the edge of the settlement, paid the docking fee without complaint, and walked the rest of the way under a pale, tired sun. The hall inside smelled like paper and dust, even though most of the records had been digital for longer than I had been alive, an old habit of the species who built the place, apparently keeping the smell of paper pumped through the air vents because the actual paper had been gone for centuries. I found that strangely comforting. Some things outlasted their own usefulness simply because people missed them. A records clerk near the entrance barely looked up from her console when I asked for anything related to exchange policy on human contracts. She tapped a few keys, frowned, tapped a few more, and finally turned the screen toward me with an apologetic shrug. She was young by the look of her, young enough that the request probably meant nothing to her beyond an unusual search query on an otherwise quiet shift. I envied that for a moment, the simple luxury of not knowing why a question like mine might matter. There is a policy line, she said. That is all there is. One line. I read it myself just to be sure she was not simplifying things for my benefit. The Concord Exchange does not accept, fulfill, or assist in the termination of any human contract under any circumstance for any client at any price. Violation of this policy results in immediate and permanent termination from the Guild. That was the entire entry. No explanation, no history, no reason given for a rule that overrode every other rule the exchange had ever written, the kind of rule that existed above payment, above loyalty, above everything else that normally decided how this business worked. Is there more somewhere else? I asked. An older file, something that explains why this exists. The clerk hesitated in a way that told me more than her words did. There used to be, she said, a longer entry with details. It was removed about 200 years ago, around the time the Guild reorganized its leadership. Whatever it said, somebody decided it was safer for new operatives to know the rule and not the reason. I thanked her and left before she could ask why an operative on an active contract was suddenly so curious about a piece of Guild history nobody had cared about in 2 centuries. There was one person I knew who might remember what that longer entry used to say. I had not spoken to him in almost 40 years, and the last time we had spoken it had not ended well. But Aldrich Voss was old enough and had been in the business long enough that if anyone still carried the truth behind that single policy line, it was him. He lived on a moon nobody visited on purpose, a cold, rocky place with one small settlement built into the side of a crater, far from any trade route worth the fuel to reach it. That was exactly the kind of place a retired operative chose when he wanted to be left alone, and exactly the kind of place I now needed to disturb. The flight took most of a day time I spent reviewing everything in Daniel Cole's file again, looking for anything I had missed the first time. There was nothing new to find. A data recovery specialist, unremarkable, untouched by violence or scandal, suddenly worth more money dead or delivered than most planetary leaders were worth alive. The contradiction sat in my chest like a stone I could not put down. Aldrich Settlement came into view through a haze of pale dust kicked up by old mining equipment nobody had bothered to remove. I landed near a cluster of buildings that looked half abandoned, though smoke rose steadily from one chimney, proof that somebody still called this place home. He answered door before I finished knocking, which told me he had been watching my ship descend the entire time. 300 years had not slowed him down as much as I expected. He looked older, grayer, the ridges along his jaw worn smooth with age, but his eyes were as sharp and unreadable as ever. Fiorani's Thade, he said, like he was tasting the name to see if it still fit. I wondered how long it would take, how long would take for someone to come asking. He stepped aside to let me in, which I had not expected. The last time we parted, he had made it clear he never wanted to see me again. Apparently 40 years, and whatever was happening now had changed his mind. Sit down, this is not a short conversation, and I am too old to have it standing up. His home inside was sparse, a single room with a fire, a worn chair, and shelves lined with objects that meant nothing to me but clearly meant everything to him. I sat across from him and waited because I had learned a long time ago that pushing Aldrich Voss only ever made him talk less. You have a contract, he said finally. It was not a question. How would you know that? Because the only reason anyone comes looking for the old story is because they are standing close enough to the new one to smell it. He stared into the fire for a long moment before continuing. Blank species field triple rate, a short window before backup gets sent. Am I close? My silence answered for me. He nodded slowly like a man confirming something he had hoped would never happen again in his lifetime. There was a job, he said, long before you joined the exchange, long before most of the operatives working today were even born. A client wanted a target removed, and the species field on that contract was blank, the same as yours. The operative who took it did not check closely enough or did not care to. By the time anyone realized what the target actually was, the job was already finished. Human, I said. Human. Aldrich and LT Unk and GT's voice flattened on the word like it cost him something to say it out loud. The first and only time, as far as anyone has ever told me, that a conquered operative completed a contract against one of them. What happened? He looked at me then, and something in his expression made both of my hearts slow down the way they did right before something went very wrong. I was there, he said, not on the job. After it I saw what came next, and I have spent the rest of my life trying not to think about it and failing most days. He did not continue right away. I did not push him. The fire cracked and settled, and somewhere outside, wind moved old equipment in a low, groaning rhythm, and I waited because some stories could not be hurried out of a person, only allowed to come when they were ready. They came for the operative first, he said finally. Not the guild, not the client. They went straight for the one who pulled the trigger, and when they found him, there was no negotiation, no demand, no warning given to the rest of us. There was simply nothing left where he had been standing within a day of the contract being completed. How did they find him so fast? That is the part nobody has ever explained to my satisfaction. They simply did, as if the entire species had been waiting quietly for exactly this excuse, and the moment it arrived, every resource they had moved at once with a precision that should not have been possible for a species that up until that point most of known space had considered minor, unimportant, beneath serious attention. I thought of the file open on my ship's console, the unremarkable data recovery specialist with no criminal record and no powerful enemies worth more money than logic could explain. It did not stop with the operative. Aldrich continued. The client who hired the contract disappeared next, along with everyone connected to that client, every business partner, every relative who had ever taken money from them. Within a month, an entire faction that had existed for over a century with fleets and territory and influence across a dozen systems simply stopped existing. Not defeated, erased, as though someone had reached in and removed every trace of them from the universe, root and branch, without mercy and without explanation. And the exchange did nothing. The exchange wrote one line of policy and buried the rest of the story, so deep that most operatives today do not even know there is a rest of the story. He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I had arrived, he looked truly tired, the way only someone who had carried something heavy for a very long time could look. We learned the only lesson that mattered. You do not touch them. Not for any price, not for any client, not for any reason at all. Why has nobody simply hired humans then? If they are that dangerous, that capable, why are they not running half the contracts in known space themselves? Aldrich almost smiled, though there was no humor in it. Because they do not want to be, he said. From what little I understand, and I understand very little, they prefer to be underestimated. They prefer to be left alone, mostly trading and building and living their lives like anyone else, right up until somebody gives them a reason to stop preferring. That the operative who took that contract 300 years ago did not start a war. He ended one before it even had the chance to begin, simply by giving them a reason to remind everyone what they were capable of, once clearly and never again. I sat with that for a long moment, my ship's contract still sitting unfinished, the clock still counting down somewhere on the edge of my awareness. Someone is trying to make me start that war again, I said. Aldrich's eyes sharpened. Then you had better figure out who, he said, before your backup figures out how to finish what you would not. I have a name on the client side. I told him, a broker called Castor Wren. The exchange uses cutouts like him all the time for clients who want distance from the contract, so the name itself does not tell me much, but he had to be paid by someone, and whoever paid him wanted this badly enough to spend 3 times the standard rate. Without blinking, Wren Aldrich repeated the name slowly, like he was checking it against some private list in his memory. I do not know him. That is not surprising. Brokers come and go faster than most species change their fashions. But the kind of money you are describing paid that freely for a contract built to look ordinary while hiding something. This dangerous underneath, that is not the work of one broker acting alone. Someone with patience built this. Someone who understood exactly what they were buying when they left that species. Field blank, and exactly what would happen if an operative like you noticed. Before finishing the job, you think this was meant to be noticed. I think Aldrich said carefully that a contract this important would not be left to chance. If they wanted the job finished quietly, they would have hired someone who never checks twice, someone like the one your guild is sending to clean up after you. He paused. Either they made a mistake choosing you, or they did not make a mistake at all. Either they wanted someone careful, or they wanted someone who would hesitate just long enough for the timer to run out and force their back up to finish what you would not. That thought sat heavier in my chest than anything else he had said. If I refuse the contract outright, I said, the exchange reassigns it permanently, and Dask finishes it without ever knowing what he is actually completing. And if you complete it yourself, you become the second operative in 300 years. To bring that kind of attention down on all of us, Aldrich shook his head. Slowly, there is no clean path through this, Vecca. There never was. The moment you open that contract, the only choice left to you is which kind of trouble you are willing to walk toward. I stood because sitting any longer was not going to make the decision easier, and I had already used more of my 68 hours than I liked. Thank you, I said, for telling me the part of the story nobody else would. Do not thank me. Yet Aldrich walked me to the door, his steps slower than I remembered, the weight of 3 centuries finally showing in the careful way he moved. Find the man before your backup does. Find out why he is worth this much to someone, and Veka, whatever you decide. Once you find him, decide it for yourself, not for the exchange, not for the fear of what humans might do if provoked again, for yourself. That is the only part of this business that has ever been worth protecting. I left him standing in his doorway, a small gray figure against the pale dust and the cold light of a sun that did not seem to care what choices were made beneath it. My ship's navigation system was already calculating the fastest route back toward the transit station. By the time I reached the ramp, 61 hours remained on the clock. I sat in the pilot's chair, engines warming around me, and pulled up everything I had on the broadcaster. Ran one more time, searching for any thread that might lead somewhere useful before I landed in the middle of whatever this had become, a flag transaction caught my attention almost immediately, something I had missed the first time because I had not been looking for it. A second payment smaller than the contract fee sent from the same account less than a day before mine to an entirely different recipient, not an operative, not a broker, a private security contractor, the kind hired for quiet retrieval work outside guild channels, the kind clients used when they wanted a job done without leaving any trace back to the exchange at all. Someone else had been hired to reach Daniel Cole first, off the books, with no rules standing in their way. I was no longer the only one racing toward that transit station. I set my ship to maximum burn and did not look back at the moon shrinking behind me. Transit station was loud before I even docked. 100 different languages bleeding through the comm channels. Cargo haulers arguing over berth assignments, somewhere a child crying, and a parent failing to calm them down. I had been to 1,000 places like it. Crowded, indifferent, the kind of place where nobody looked too closely at anyone else because everybody had a reason not to want the same courtesy. Returned, 51 hours remained on the clock. I pulled the last known location from Daniel Cole's file and cross-referenced it against the station's public registry, looking for any record of him. Checking into lodging, paying a docking fee, renting storage space, anything that would narrow a search this large into something I could actually walk toward. It took longer than I wanted. Whoever had built his cover, if he even had one, had done a careful job of it. The station itself was built in rings, each one further from the docking core, each one a little darker and a little less concerned with the rules that governed the rings above it. I worked through 3 of them before I found anything useful, asking quiet questions of people who answered quiet questions for a price, the kind of transactions that never showed up in any official record but moved faster than official channels ever could. A vendor selling repaired electronics, remembered dark-haired man buying a portable terminal 2 days earlier, paying an untraceable credit, nervous in a way that customers rarely were over. Something so small, he had pointed me toward the lower ring without my needing to ask twice. I found him eventually through a small data brokerage on the station's lower ring, a place that bought and sold information the way other shops sold food or fuel. Cole had rented a terminal there 2 days earlier, paid an untraceable credit, and had not checked out yet. I walked through the lower ring with my hood up and my pace unhurried, the way I always moved when I did not want to be remembered. Corridors here were narrower, the lighting dimmer, the crowd thinner and more watchful. People who used the lower ring tended to notice things because noticing things was often the difference between a profitable trade and a dangerous one. The data brokerage sat between a repair shop and a shuttered storefront, its windows dark despite a sign claiming it was open. I tried the door, locked but not sealed, the kind of lock that meant someone inside had simply turned the latch rather than activating any real security. That was wrong. A shop like this should have had better locks than that. I went in carefully, weapon ready but lowered, and found the brokerage empty except for 2 things: a terminal still glowing with an active session and a thin trail of blood leading from behind the counter toward a back exit. Not enough to suggest a death, but enough to suggest someone had been hurt and had left under their own power or close to it. I followed the trail. The back exit opened into a service corridor, narrow and poorly lit, the kind of space built for maintenance crews rather than foot traffic. The blood trail continued along the floor, smudged in places where someone had braced themselves against the wall to keep moving. I followed it at a flat run, every instinct telling me I was already too late, that whoever had left this trail had been carried off somewhere I would never reach in time. The corridor opened into a loading bay, and that was where I found him. Daniel Cole was pressed into a gap between 2 cargo containers, one hand pressed against his side, blood seeping between his fingers, his other hand holding a length of pipe like it was the only weapon he had managed to find. He was younger than his file photo suggested, dark-haired, Sharpie despite the pain clearly written across his face, and the moment he saw me step into the bay, he raised that pipe like he intended to use it. "Stay back," he said, voice tight but steady, steadier than I expected. from someone bleeding this much. I am not here to hurt you, I said, which was true in a way I had not fully admitted to myself until the words left my mouth. That is exactly what someone here to hurt me would say. Fair point. I kept my hands visible and did not move. Closer, 3 of them, he said. Breathing hard, came into the shop. While I was pulling data off a drive, I got one of them with the pipe before the other 2 decided I was worth more trouble than I looked. I do not know where they went. I do not know why. I said, or close enough to it that got his attention more than anything else I had said. He studied me for a long moment, the pipe still raised, blood still slipping between his fingers, and something in his expression shifted from immediate fear into something more calculating. You are an operative, he said. Conquered exchange. I have heard the stories. Hired killers who will not take a job against my species no matter who is paying. That is the rule. Yes. Then why are you here? Before I could answer, the loading bay door at the far end ground open and 2 figures stepped through, armored, weapons drawn, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who had already decided this would not take long. I did not wait for them to speak. I moved between them and Cole, weapon up, and the first shot came almost immediately. A bright streak that I deflected off the edge of the cargo container rather than my own body. The second armored figure circled wide, trying to flank, and I let them think it was working right up until I closed the distance and put them down hard against the container wall. The first one recovered faster than I expected, driving toward me with a blade instead of a weapon. Close quarters, the kind of fight that did not leave room for thinking, only reacting. I caught the strike on my forearm, felt the edge bite shallow through fabric and skin, and used the momentum to pull them off balance and put them down beside their partner. For a moment the bay went quiet except for our breathing and the distant hum of the station's recycled air. I checked the 2 figures on the ground, both armored in matching dark plating with no insignia, no markings, nothing to identify who had sent them or which company they answered to. Professional, expensive, the kind of hired hands that did not get sent after anyone unimportant. Behind me, Cole had not stayed pressed against the containers like I expected. He had moved, dragging a length of cable across the loading bay floor at exactly the moment I needed an opening, tripping a 3rd figure I had not even seen enter, who went down hard enough to lose their weapon across the floor. You could have told me there was a 3rd one, I said. You could have told me you were bringing friends, he said back, breathing hard, one hand still pressed to his side. We did not have time to do anything else. A klaxon began sounding somewhere above us, station security responding to the weapon's discharge, which meant we had minutes, not hours, before this loading bay filled with people who would ask questions neither of us wanted to answer. My ship, I said. Now he did not argue. That told me something about him too, the way he simply moved when moving was the only sensible choice. No wasted time demanding explanations he could clearly get later. We made it back through the service corridor and out onto the lower ring at a pace that aggravated his wound with every step, though he did not complain about it once. I kept watch on every junction we passed, every shadow that could have held a 4th attacker, and found none, though the feeling of being followed did not leave me the entire way back to my ship, to station. Security officers crossed our path near the ring's central junction, weapons holstered but eyes alert, scanning the crowd for whoever had triggered the alarm in the loading bay behind us. I pulled Cole sideways into a narrow gap between a noodle stall and a row of storage lockers, pressing both of us flat against the wall while the officers passed within arm's reach, close enough that I could hear their calm chatter. Something about a weapons discharge and witnesses fleeing toward the docking. Cole's breathing had gone shallow and fast beside me, more from pain than fear, I thought, though it was hard to be certain with someone I had known for less than 20 minutes. I waited until the officers turned down a side corridor before pulling him back into the moving crowd where two more strangers among hundreds drew no attention at all. Once we were inside and the ramp had sealed behind us, I finally let myself breathe. Cole sat heavily against the bulkhead, pressing a cloth I had thrown him against the wound in his side. It was not deep. I had seen worse on people who walked away laughing, but it needed attention I was not equipped to give. Beyond basic field supplies, who were they, he asked, once the ship had cleared the station and entered open space. Private security, I said, hired off the books, separate from the contract that brought me here. Someone wanted you removed quietly without a trail back to anyone official. And the contract that brought you here. I hesitated because saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it had not. Someone hired the Concord Exchange to bring you in. I said the species field on the contract was left blank. I did not know what you were until I was already 2 days into the job. He went very still. You did not know I was human? No, and now that you do. I did not answer right away because I did not yet have an answer that felt complete. He watched me with the same sharp, calculating look from the loading bay, weighing something, and whatever conclusion he reached, he seemed to settle into it before speaking again. There is a reason someone wants me removed, he said. I found something I was not supposed to find. He pulled a small data drive from an inner pocket, scratched and worn, the kind of object that had clearly survived more than one rough handling. I do recovery works, he said, pulling data from wreckage. Mostly insurance claims, mostly boring. 3 weeks ago, I was contracted to recover records from a transport ship that had been reported lost with all cargo. Standard job, except the records I pulled were not insurance documents. They were shipping manifests for weapons, moved through a chain of shell companies, all of them tracing back eventually to one buyer, who a faction calling itself the HFY Compact. I had never heard of them before 3 weeks ago. I have heard plenty since, mostly from the people who have been trying to kill me. He turned the drive over in his hands. They are stockpiling weapons on a scale that does not make sense for trade disputes or local conflicts, the kind of scale that suggests they are preparing for something much bigger. And Castor Wren, I said slowly, the broker who hired my contract. Cole's expression sharpened. That name is on the shipping manifests, he said 3 times. The pieces settled into place with a weight that made both of my hearts feel suddenly too loud in my chest. A blank species field designed to either be caught by a careless operative who would finish the job without ever knowing, or by a careful one who would hesitate just long enough to run out the clock and hand the job to someone like Selvin Drosk instead. A faction stockpiling weapons, hiding behind cutouts and shell Companies eliminating the one person who had stumbled onto proof of what they were building. This was never simply about removing an inconvenient witness. They want a finished contract, I said, quietly, more to myself than to him, an operative credentialed by the exchange, completing a kill against a human on record with guild authorization attached to it, not because they care about you, specifically because of what happens next once word of that contract reaches the rest of known space. Cole's face had gone pale, and not from blood loss. They want a war, he said. They want the excuse for one, I said, and right now I'm the excuse they paid for. He was quiet after that, staring at the data drive in his hands like it had grown heavier in the last few minutes. I pulled a medical kit from a storage panel and knelt beside him, motioning for him to move the cloth away from his side so I could see the wound properly. It was shallow, a graze more than a true injury, though it had bled enough to frighten anyone who had never seen worse. This is going to need cleaning before it closes properly, I said. It will not feel pleasant. None of today has felt pleasant, he said. I do not see why this part should be different. He did not flinch much while I worked, though his jaw tightened at the worst of it, and his hands stayed busy the entire time turning the data drive over and over between his fingers, the way some people needed something small to hold on to when everything large around them had stopped making sense. I recognized the habit. I had seen it in 100 frightened clients across 3 centuries, though I had never once stopped to wonder what it actually meant until I watched him do it. You keep looking at that drive like it owes you an apology, I said, mostly to fill the silence while I finished the bandage. It is the only thing I have left that proves any of this is real, he said. My apartment is probably being searched right now. My contacts are probably being questioned, or worse, everyone I have spoken to in the last 3 weeks is at risk because of what is sitting in my hand, and I cannot even hand it to anyone who might actually do something with it, because the people most likely to receive it are the same people who sent those 3 men after me in the first place. Who is behind the Ashfold compact? I asked. The name, someone who could authorize this much money for a contract this dangerous. Corin Lacer, he said. He runs it or leads it or whatever word fits. A man who has spent the last decade building a private army out of grievances nobody else takes seriously anymore. I only found his name because it appeared on 2 of the manifests, buried under layers of shell companies. That took me a week to untangle. He does not advertise himself. From what little I have gathered, he believes the rest of known space has grown soft, complacent, unwilling to use the kind of force that built half the empires currently sitting comfortably in power. He thinks a war would clear that complacency out. He simply needed a spark that nobody could blame on him directly, and a conquered operative finishing a contract against a human with guild authorization on record gives him exactly that spark. It gives him proof that even the people who refuse to touch humans can be made to do it anyway given the right circumstances, Cole said, which means nobody is actually safe from them, which means humanity needs to remind everyone why they have been left alone all this time. That is the message he wants sent. He does not care who delivers it, only that it gets delivered. I sat back on my heels and looked at him properly for the first time since the loading bay passed. The blood in the torn jacket and the exhaustion written plainly across his face. He held my gaze without flinching, which very few people manage to do. Human or otherwise, why are you not more frightened? I asked. You should be. I am frightened, he said. I have been frightened for 3 weeks straight. I have simply run out of room to show it. Usefully, so it mostly just sits there. Now underneath everything else, he paused, studying me with the same careful attention he had given the drive. What about you? You said you did not know what I was until you were already 2 days into this. Most of your kind would have walked away the moment they realized. Why did you keep going? I did not have an honest answer ready, not one I was willing to say out loud yet. So I gave him the smaller truth instead, because someone tried to make sure I would not get the chance to choose, I said. And I have never liked being told what I am allowed to decide. He almost smiled at that, the first real expression that was not pain or fear since I had found him in the loading bay. My calm chimed before either of us could say anything else, the alert tone reserved specifically for Concord exchange dispatch, sharp and impossible to ignore. I opened it without speaking. A short message scrolled across the screen, 3 lines, nothing more. Backup operative status updated. Selvin Drosk has departed for the transit station. Estimated arrival 6 hours. Cole. Read it over my shoulder, his expression sliding back into the same tight weariness from the loading bay. 6 hours. He said, is that enough time to do whatever it is you are planning to do? I closed the message and looked at the navigation display already running calculations. I did not like the results of. No, I said, it is not, but it is the only 6 hours we're going to get. 6 hours was barely enough time to decide what kind of trouble I wanted next, let alone solve the one already sitting my cargo hold. I pulled my ship away from the transit station and set a course for open space, far enough from any registered lane that nobody would stumble across us by accident. Cole sat in the co-pilot seat, still pale, still holding that data drive like it was the last solid thing in his world, watching the stars shift outside the viewport. Without really seeing them, we cannot simply run, he said. Eventually, Drac will find this ship eventually. Whoever sent those 3 men in the loading bay will keep sending more. Running only buys time, not safety. I'm aware, I said. Then what is the plan? I did not have one yet, not a complete one, and admitting that out loud felt like handing him one more thing to be frightened of. Instead, I pulled up everything my ship systems could gather on Corin Lacater and the Ashifold compact, looking for a thread that might turn this from a problem I was running from into a problem I could actually end. There was less public information than I expected for a man building a private army. Leicester had no registered residence, no confirmed home world, nothing beyond a handful of grainy images taken at events he had clearly not wanted photographed. What I did find was a pattern scattered across several systems over the last 3 years of weapons shipments, recruitment drives among disillusioned soldiers from a dozen failed conflicts, in a slow, careful accumulation of territory in regions too poor or too forgotten for anyone else to bother defending. The images I found showed a tall, narrow man with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness in his posture that came from someone who had spent a long time learning to be underestimated. In one image taken at what appeared to be a recruitment gathering, he stood slightly apart from a crowd of armed soldiers, watching them rather than addressing them like a man studying tools rather than leading people. I did not like the way that image sat in my memory once I had seen it. He has been building this for years, I said quietly, patiently. Whatever this contract was supposed to accomplish, it was never the beginning of his plan. It was meant to be the final piece, the spark, Cole said. The spark. I leaned back from the console, both of my hearts beating a little faster than the conversation alone should have caused. A finished human contract gives him exactly what he needs, proof that the one line nobody crosses can be crossed, given the right pressure. That alone might be enough to convince enough disillusioned people across enough systems that the old rules do not matter anymore, that the line was never as solid as everyone believed. Cole was quiet for a long moment, turning the drive over in his hands. Again, that same small anchoring habit. You keep talking about this like it is only a political problem, he said. Line that gets crossed, a rule that gets broken, but you said something earlier that I have not been able to stop thinking about. The first time it happened 300 years ago. What actually happened? I had been waiting for that question since the moment I told him about the policy line, and I still was not ready for it. An operative finished a contract against a human, I said, long before either of us were born. Within a day, the operative who did it was gone. Within a month, an entire faction connected to the client had stopped existing, erased root and branch by a response that nobody outside your species has ever fully understood. That is not what I asked. I looked at him then, and something in his expression told me he already suspected there was more to this than the second-hand history Aldrich had given me, more than I had told him. I was a young operative when it happened, I said, barely finished with my training. I was not involved in the contract. I was not anywhere near the operative who took it, but 3 weeks after it happened, my unit was sent to a station on the edge of the territory that used to belong to that faction to confirm reports of what had happened. There, the cockpit had gone very quiet, the hum of the engines the only sound. Between us, I was thrown back 5 years. The moment I walked into that station, I stopped there. I had not meant to say that much, had not meant to let that particular sentence escape into the open air of my own ship, and I did not explain it further because there was nothing about that day I was willing to explain, not to him, not to anyone, not even after 300 years of carrying it. Cole did not push. He watched me for a moment, something careful and understanding settling into his expression, and then he looked back out the viewport, letting the silence hold whatever it needed to hold. Anger rushed through me a moment later, sudden and familiar, a known thing I reached for, the way other people reach for steady ground. It was easier than the alternative. It always had been. I focused on the console in front of me, on the steady glow of the navigation display, on anything that was not the memory trying to surface behind it, and let the anger carry me back to something resembling steady ground. We need to get ahead of this, I said, my voice harder than it needed to be. Not run from Drosk, not hide from lasers. People get ahead of all of it before either one of them decides the timeline does not matter anymore. How the contract that hired me, I said, it came through Castor Wren, the broker whose name is on your shipping manifests. If I can find him, I can find proof Connecting this contract directly to Lacier proved that the exchange itself was never the actual target. We were the weapon. If I can show the guild leadership that before Drosk finishes what I would not, this contract becomes worthless to Lacer the moment it becomes public, and if you cannot find Ren in time, I did not answer that, because the answer was not one either of us wanted to hear out loud. My calm chimed again, a different tone this time, lower priority but still urgent enough to demand attention. I opened it and found a tracking ping, not from the exchange but from a private channel I recognized only because I had used a similar one myself years ago on jobs that required absolute discretion. Someone had found my ship's signature. They're tracking us, I said, already. Pulling up navigation already. Calculating evasive routes through the nearest debris field that might scatter our signal long enough to think. Drosk, no, too early for Dask. This is someone else. I watched the ping. Repeat, closer now, a single vessel. Closing distance faster than any standard transport should have been able to manage. Private security like the ones in the loading bay. Lacater is not waiting for the contract timer to run out. He is hedging his bet. Cole's hand tightened around the data drive. What do? We make sure that drive survives this conversation, I said already, pulling the ship into a hard turn toward the debris field, engines straining against the sudden change in direction. Whatever happens next, that proof is the only thing that turns this from a war into a footnote. The pursuing vessel matched my turn almost perfectly, gaining ground with every passing second, and a weapons lock alert flashed. Read across my console less than a minute later. They are not trying to capture us, I said. They are trying to end this before it goes any further. Can you lose them in the debris field? I can try. Pushed the engines harder than I liked, the ship groaning under the strain. First scattered chunks of broken hull and old wreckage beginning to fill the viewport ahead of us, remnants of some battle fought long before either Cole or I had been born. Hold on to something. That is not me. This is going to get worse before it gets better. The first shot clipped our outer hull as we entered the debris field, a hard jolt that rattled through the entire ship and sent a cascade of warning lights across the console. I weaved between two larger fragments, using their bulk to break the pursuing vessel's weapons lock, buying seconds rather than safety. A second shot followed close behind the first, missing wide as I cut hard to port. Ship's frame creaking under the strain of a turn it had not been designed to make at this speed. Cole gripped the edge of his seat with one hand, the data drive still clenched tight in the other. His clear as throat, knuckles pale against his skin. They are gaining, he said, watching the rear sensor display with the kind of focused calm that came from having no other choice but calm. They are faster, I admitted, newer engines, better suited for open pursuit than my ship was ever built for. There, Cole said suddenly, pointing toward a gap between two larger wreck sections, barely wide enough for my ship to fit through. If you can get through there before they catch the angle, the wreck behind it should block their scanners completely. I did not ask how he knew that. I simply trusted it because we did not have time for anything else and threaded my ship through the gap with barely a hand's width of clearance on either side, the hull groaning in protest the entire way through. The pursuing vessel's weapons lock dropped a moment later, lost behind the dense wreckage now sitting between us. I held my course steady for another full minute, before finally easing back on the engines, both of my heart still hammering against my ribs. How did you know that gap would block there? Scanners, I asked. I did not. Cole said. I guessed. Old Recreckfield scatter sensor returns badly. It is the first thing they teach you in data recovery work, and salvage crews use it constantly to avoid detection while working sites nobody wants found. He let out a breath that shook slightly on the way out, the adrenaline finally catching up with him now that the immediate danger had passed. I am very glad that guess was correct. So am I. We sat in silence for a moment, the ship drifting slow and quiet among the wreckage, both of us catching our breath in our own way. Then my comm chimed a third time, and this alert carried the priority tag I had been dreading since the moment I first saw Selvin Drosk's name attached to my contract. Drosk had arrived at the transit station early, and Drosk had already found my last recorded heading. A message followed less than a minute later. Text only, no greeting, no formality, exactly the kind of communication I would have expected from a name that had built its reputation on finishing jobs other operatives refused. Contract status unchanged at 60 hours. Mark target not delivered. Proceeding to current heading. Step aside, Vecca, or I finish this for both of us. Cole read it beside me, his expression tightening in a way that told me he understood exactly what those words meant even without knowing Draw's history the way I did. He thinks this is still a simple contract, Cole said. He does not need to think anything else. I said all he needs to know is that the timer ran out and I did not deliver. Everything past that point is just paperwork to him. Can you talk to him? Explain what is actually happening. I thought about that for longer than I wanted to admit. Drosk was not cruel, not in the way laced hired men were cruel. He simply did not ask the questions that would have made this contract complicated, the same way he had never asked them on any job before this one, and that in curiosity had kept his record clean and his reputation solid for longer than most operatives lasted in this business at all. I do not know if it will matter, I said, but we are going to find out because he is already on his way, and running from him is not a strategy that lasts, Cole said. The data drive down on the console between us, the first time he had let go of it since the loading bay, and rubbed both hands over his face like a man trying to wake himself up from something that refused to end. Then we need a real plan, he said, not just survive the next hour. An actual plan. Ren operates out of a station 3 jumps from here, I said, pulling the coordinates up from memory rather than the file. Sensor. Brokers like him rarely left themselves easy to trace, a place built specifically for clients who do not want to be seen meeting anyone. If I can reach him before Drosk reaches us, I can get a confession on record, something that ties him directly to Lacer and the manifests you already recovered. Combined, that is enough to bring before guild leadership. And if Ren will not talk, brokers like Ren survive by knowing exactly how much trouble they can afford. I said he will talk if the alternative looks worse than talking does. Cole studied me for a moment, something unreadable behind his tired eyes. You sound very certain for someone who did not have a plan. 10 minutes ago, I did not have all of it. 10 minutes ago, I said I have enough of it. Now, the station where Caster Wren did Business called itself neutral ground, which mostly meant it was small enough that nobody powerful had bothered claiming it yet, and quiet enough that the people who used it preferred to keep it that way. We arrived with less than 40 hours left on the contract clock, and a private security vessel somewhere behind us, still searching the debris field for a signal it had lost, and Selvin Drosk closing the distance between us with the patient, unhurried confidence of someone who had never once needed to rush a job to finish it. Cole had recovered enough during the flight to stand without obvious pain, though I noticed him favoring his side whenever he thought I was not watching. He had spent most of the journey studying the shipping manifests again, cross-referencing names and dates, building a clearer picture of exactly how deep Lacier's reach extended. There is a pattern in the payment dates, he said as we approached the station's outer docking ring. Ren receives a payment, and within a week a new contract appears somewhere in Concord Exchange. Records not always for removal, sometimes retrieval, sometimes information gathering. I think this was never only about me. I think he has been testing the rule for months in smaller ways before betting everything on a contract big enough to matter, testing how operatives respond to incomplete information. I said, the pieces settling into a shape I did not like, building confidence that the system could be pushed without anyone noticing before he pushed it as far as it could go. That is what worries me, Cole said. If this fails, he will simply try again. Different broker, a different blank field, a different operative who does not stop to ask why a contract feels wrong. I did not have an answer to that yet, so I did not offer one. We docked under a false registration I kept for situations exactly like this one, and made our way through the station toward the address Ren used for meetings, a narrow office tucked between a currency exchange and a shuttered cargo agent. The kind of location chosen specifically because nobody walking past would think twice about it. The office door was locked properly this time. Real security, rather than the careless latch at Cole's brokerage. I worked the lock with tools I kept for exactly this purpose, slower than I liked given our timeline, and finally felt it give way beneath my hands. Inside, the office was empty, not abandoned, empty in a way that suggested someone had left in a hurry. Drawers pulled open, a chair knocked sideways, a half-finished drink left sitting on the desk, condensation still beating down its side. He knew we were coming, Cole said, or he ran from someone else entirely. I checked the desk terminal, still active, and found a single open communication log, the last message sent less than an hour earlier. It was addressed to Lacer directly, no cutout, no broker code between them, which told me Ren had grown frightened enough to abandon the careful distance he usually kept from his employer. The operative has not delivered, backup has been dispatched, but the window is closing. If this fails, they will trace the contract back to me, and from me to you. I am leaving the station. Send payment to the usual account. And we never spoke again. He is running, I said, which means he is panicking, which means he might still be reachable before he disappears completely. A new alert flashed across my comm before I could finish the thought. The priority tag I had been waiting for since the debris field Drosk had docked. I turned to find him already standing in the office doorway, weapon holstered but his hand resting easy near it, his expression giving away nothing at all. He was taller than me, built like someone who relied on strength as readily as skill, with pale gray eyes that moved between me and Cole without a flicker of surprise. You found him faster than I expected, Dask said, stepping into the office without waiting for an invitation. I will admit, V, this is not the kind of trouble I assumed you would walk into. This is not what you think it is, I said. It is a contract, he said simply. Retrieval, with a deadline that is already passed. Whatever complicated story you have built around it does not change what is sitting on the exchange ledger. His gaze shifted to Cole, lingering for a moment, with something that was not quite curiosity. I do not need to know why this one is worth so much. I only need to deliver him. Listen to me, I said, stepping between them without entirely deciding to. This contract was never about retrieval. It was built to force an operative into completing a kill against a human on record with guild authorization attached. The client is a man named Corvin Laister, building a private army out of exactly this kind of provocation. If you finish this job, you are not closing a contract, you are giving him the war he has been trying to start for years. Dask studied me for a long moment, and for the first time since he had entered the room, something shifted behind his careful expression. That is a significant claim, he said. I have proof. Cole stepped forward, holding out the data drive with a steadiness I admired, given everything his hands had been through in the last 2 days. Shipping manifests, payment records, a communication log sitting on that terminal right now, addressed directly to Laister. Panicking about exactly this contract failing, Drosk did not move to take the drive. Immediately, he looked at me instead, weighing something I could not entirely read. If this is true, he said slowly, the exchange needs to know before either of us does anything further. The exchange will bury it, I said, the same way they buried the truth about the first time this happened 300 years ago. One line of policy and silence around everything else. If we hand this to guild leadership quietly, Laister simply waits, finds another broker, another blank field, another operative who does not stop to question it. Cole already suspects this was a test run for something larger. If we do this quietly, we only delay the next attempt. Then, what do you suggest? I had been turning this over since the debris field, the shape of it settling clearer the closer we got to this moment, and saying it out loud finally made it feel solid rather than reckless. We make it public, I said, not just to guild leadership, to every exchange channel, every open network across known space that will carry it, the manifests, the communication log, the contract itself, with its blank species field intact. Everyone sees exactly what Laister tried to manufacture and exactly how close it came to working. He loses the one thing he actually needed, which was deniability. A war built on a secret does not survive becoming public. Knowledge draws you tightened. That would end your career, he said, exposing exchange contract details publicly violates guild law as completely as finishing a human contract does. You would be choosing one kind of permanent termination over another. I am aware, I said, and you are willing to do that for him. Draw an LT Uncan GT. Eyes moved to Cole. Again, something almost like genuine curiosity finally breaking through his composure. I am willing to do it because The alternative is worse for everyone. Not only for him, I said. If Lacer gets his war, it will not stay contained to one faction or one station, you know. That as well as I do. Drosk was quiet for a long time, long enough that I began calculating what came next if he refused, whether I could move fast enough to broadcast the evidence before he stopped me, whether Cole would survive whatever happened in this small office in the next several minutes. I have never once questioned a contract in 30 years, Dask said finally, not because I believed every job I took was clean, because questioning them was not my job, finishing them was. He looked at the data drive still held out in Cole's hand, but I have also never been handed proof like this on a job built specifically to make me complicit in something I never agreed to be part of. He reached out and took the drive, turning it over once in his hand before passing it back. Do what you are planning to do, he said quickly. Before I have time to decide, this was a mistake. I did not waste the offer. I moved to the terminal, pulled the data from Cole's drive alongside the communication log already open on the screen and began assembling the broadcast. Every piece of evidence laid out in plain, undeniable order. Cole worked beside me faster with the technical details than I was formatting the manifests into something any reader across any species could understand at a glance. This is going to reach everyone, Cole said quietly, watching the broadcast queue fill with target channels, every exchange contact, every open network, every government feed within range. There is no taking this back once it sends. That is the point, I said. I know, he said. I'm only saying it out loud because it deserves to be said out loud once before it happens. I understood that more than I expected to. A heavy impact shook the office door before either of us could finish preparing the final upload. Metal buckling under something far stronger than a simple kick. Dask moved first, drawing his weapon and putting himself between the door and the terminal. Without a word, the same easy professionalism I had seen in him on the rare occasions our paths had crossed before this job. Lacators people, I said, already guessing the answer before the door finally gave way. He knows Ren panicked. He sent someone to clean up the broker before the trail led any further. 3 armored figures pushed through the broken doorway, weapons already raised, and the small office became a very dangerous place to stand still in. Drac fired first, dropping the lead figure before they cleared the threshold, and I pulled Cole down behind the desk, putting solid furniture between him and the line of fire while the upload continued crawling toward completion on the terminal above us. Keep that running, I told him. No matter what happens, do not stop that upload. He nodded, already reaching up from behind the desk to keep his hands on the console, eyes fixed on the progress bar instead of the fight unfolding around him, trusting me and Drosk to handle the rest because there was nothing else useful he could do. The second figure came around the side of the desk, and I met them there, catching their weapon arm and driving them back into a filing cabinet hard enough to end the disagreement quickly. Drac handled the third with the same economical efficiency he brought to everything. No wasted movement, no unnecessary risk, simply a problem identified and removed with practice. Certainty. The office went quiet again, almost as fast as it had erupted. 3 more armored figures down, the terminal still glowing steadily above the desk. where Cole had not once taken his hands. Off the console, upload at 80%, he said. Voice tight but steady, more are coming. Dask said, checking the corridor. Outside the broken door, I count at least 4 more signatures moving this way from the docking ring. Whoever Lacier sent here was not planning on leaving witnesses. Then we hold this office until that upload finishes, I said, already moving to brace the broken door with whatever furniture I could drag into place, however long that takes. It will take exactly as long as it takes, Cole said. I still locked on the screen, and I cannot make it move faster by wanting it to. The next several minutes passed, and the kind of controlled chaos that made the rest of the galaxy disappear entirely. Nothing left but the door, the approaching footsteps, and the slow, agonizing climb of a progress bar that refused to hurry, no matter how badly all 3 of us needed it to. Dask and I held the doorway between us, trading the worst of it back and forth while Cole called out the percentage every time it ticked upward, a strange steady countdown running underneath the noise of the fight. 95, he said, just as the door finally buckled fully inward under one last heavy strike. I do not know exactly which of us reached the last attacker first. It did not matter. What mattered was the small, simple chime from the terminal a moment later, confirming what none of Lacier's remaining people could undo. It is done, Cole said, breathless, finally pulling his hands back from the console. The broadcast is out. The corridor outside had gone quiet. Whatever remained of Lacier's cleanup crew, apparently deciding that a finished broadcast made the rest of this fight pointless. Dask lowered his weapon slowly, breathing hard, glancing once at the wrecked office around us before looking back at me. Well, he said, that settles that question rather thoroughly. The broadcast had gone out 3 minutes earlier than it would have, without the fight spreading faster than I had anticipated. The kind of story too strange and too dangerous to ignore, even on networks that usually buried anything inconvenient within the hour. Guild channels were already flooding with confirmation requests, with outrage, with questions about how deep this reached and who else had been involved. Lacier's name spread with it, attached now to manifests and payment trails that could not simply be denied away. Whatever deniability he had built his entire plan around had ended the moment that broadcast left my ship's terminal. Dask stood near the office door the entire time, watching without comment until the broadcast finished and the confirmation requests began pouring in faster than either Cole or I could answer them. You understand what happens to you now, he said. Yes, the exchange will not forgive this, not the broadcast, not the unfinished contract, not any of it. You will not be welcome anywhere guild business is conducted for the rest of however long you intend to keep living. I know what I am giving up, I said. I decided that before I sent it. Drosk nodded slowly, something that was not quite respect, but was not far from it either, settling into his expression. Then I suppose my contract is also unfinished, he said, since the target you were assigned to retrieve no longer exists on any ledger I am willing to honor. He turned toward the door, pausing only once more before leaving. For what it is worth, I do not think this was a mistake. I simply think it was an expensive kind of correct. He left without another word, and I did not expect to see him again, though something in the way he had said It suggested our paths were not finished, crossing whatever shape that took in. Whatever years remained ahead, and I stood alone in the broker's abandoned office for a long while after that. The terminal still glowing with confirmation requests. Neither of us had the energy left to answer, "What happens to me now?" He asked eventually. "You go back to your life," I said. "Lacater has lost the only thing that made silencing you worthwhile. Killing you now would only confirm everything the broadcast already proved. You are safer exposed than you were hidden, and I did not have a clean answer for that, not yet, not a way that felt true rather than simply convenient. I find out what is left of a career after you burn it down on purpose," I said. He studied me for a long moment, the same careful weighing look from the loading bay, though something in it had shifted since then into something quieter, something that did not need explaining any more than the rest of what had passed between us over the last 2 days. "Thank you," he started to say. "Do not," I said, and he stopped, understanding it the way he had understood most things since I found him bleeding behind those cargo containers without needing it spelled out further. He left the station 3 days later on a transport bound back toward whatever life remained for him after this, and he did not look back as the ramp closed behind him, and I did not call after him to ask him to. I stayed behind in the small empty office a while longer, listening to a terminal still chiming with messages from a guild that no longer wanted my name attached to anything it valued, and somewhere behind my ribs both of my hearts kept beating steady, and even the way they always had, the way they would keep beating long after this particular story stopped mattering to anyone but the two of us who had lived through it. The rule held: nobody finished the contract, nobody started the war Lacier had spent years building toward, not that week, not because of anything I had done in that small office on a forgotten station, but everyone who mattered now remembered exactly why the rule existed in the first place, and exactly how close it had come to breaking. And I found, sitting alone with both of my hearts still beating steady against the silence, that I could live with whatever came next as long as that much remained.